Around 1200 BCE, the ancient world burned. From the great palaces of Mycenaean Greece to the fortified cities of the Hittite Empire, from the harbours of Cyprus to the fertile plains of Canaan, civilization itself seemed to unravel in a single human lifetime. For centuries, the Late Bronze Age had been an era of kings and empires, of trade and diplomacy stretching across thousands of miles. Merchants sailed the eastern Mediterranean with cargoes of tin and copper, the lifeblood metals that, when fused together, created bronze, the technology that armed armies, crowned kings, and shaped the tools of daily life. We know the story not from a single source, but from fragments. Inscriptions, burned tablets, and the blackened ruins of once mighty cities. The Hittite capital of Hattusa, a sprawling city of temples and palaces, was abandoned and left to crumble. The Mycenaean strongholds of Greece fell silent, their Linear B records ending mid-sentence. In the Levant, the prosperous port cities of Ugarit and Ashkelon were reduced to ash. One explanation tells of invasion, the mysterious sea peoples, named by the Egyptians, who descended on the Mediterranean coastlines in a wave of destruction. The reliefs on the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III depict chaotic naval battles, Egyptian ships ramming enemy vessels, archers firing into crowds of warriors wearing feathered headdresses and horned helmets. Ramesses claimed victory, boasting that the invaders were slaughtered or taken prisoner. Yet even Egypt, the supposed victor, emerged weakened, its empire reduced and its economy strained. Who were these sea peoples? Were they pirates driven by hunger, displaced tribes fleeing famine, mercenaries turned marauders after the collapse of the powers that once employed them? No single identity fits. They seem to have been a coalition of desperate peoples, moving together like a storm across the Mediterranean. But invasion alone cannot explain the depth and scale of the collapse. Archaeological evidence points to widespread famine during this period. Pollen analysis from sediment cores in the eastern Mediterranean suggests a severe drought struck the region in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Crops failed, pastures turned to dust, and food shortages would have driven populations to migrate or raid their neighbours. Letters from the final days of Ugarit plead for grain shipments that never came. "The enemy ships are here," one desperate ruler wrote. "They have set fire to my cities and have done harm to the land. My army is in Hittite country, and my ships are in Lycia. Thus, the land is abandoned to itself." That letter was found in the city's ruins, never delivered. The clay tablet baked hard in the flames that destroyed its home. Adding to the crisis was the fragility of the Bronze Age economy itself. Bronze depended on the steady flow of tin and copper, often mined far from the kingdoms that needed them. Tin, in particular, was rare and came from distant lands, possibly as far as Central Asia or even Britain. A disruption to these trade routes could have halted weapon and tool production. At the same time, the empires of the age had grown heavily centralized, their wealth and stability dependent on palace bureaucracies. When those administrative centers fell, local communities were left without the systems that had fed and protected them. In the chaos, smaller settlements were abandoned as people fled to hilltop refuges or coastal strongholds. Literacy vanished from much of Greece for centuries, plunging it into what historians call the Greek Dark Age. Some scholars see evidence of internal rebellion, that the collapse was not merely an external catastrophe, but the result of uprisings against ruling elites. The loss was not only political and economic, but cultural. The collapse marked the end of entire writing systems, the disappearance of monumental architecture in some regions, and the loss of artistic traditions that had flourished for centuries. A person born in the days of the great Bronze Age kingdoms might have looked at the world a few decades later and found it almost unrecognizable. Where once stood palaces with storerooms overflowing with grain and oil, there were now charred walls. Where scribes once recorded royal decrees on clay tablets, the stylus lay unused. And where bronze weapons once gleamed in the hands of armies, iron began to take their place, a shift that would define the coming Iron Age. It is tempting to look for a single cause, a neat explanation for such a dramatic and widespread collapse. But history rarely works that way. The fall of the Bronze Age was likely the result of a perfect storm: climate change, famine, economic fragility, technological transition, internal rebellion, and foreign invasion, all converging within a few decades. In the face of so many simultaneous crises, even the most powerful kingdoms could not stand. The web of connections that had bound the ancient Mediterranean together unraveled strand by strand until the whole fabric tore apart. And yet from this age of destruction came the seeds of renewal. The vacuum left by the fallen empires allowed new cultures to rise. The Greeks, after centuries of darkness, would eventually produce the city-states that gave us democracy, philosophy, and epic poetry. The Phoenicians would chart new trade routes, spreading their alphabet across the seas. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah would shape religious traditions that still influence billions today. The Bronze Age was gone, but its memory lingered in myths, tales of lost golden ages, of heroes and wars, of cities that fell to fire and sword. Perhaps the legend of Troy, preserved in Homer's epics, was itself a faint echo of this great collapse. Standing among the ruins of Hattusa or Ugarit today, one can still sense the suddenness of it all. The streets are eerily frozen in time, the walls tumbled but still marking where palaces and temples once stood. It is as if the people vanished overnight, leaving only the stones to tell their story. And those stones whisper, much like the desert wind around the Sphinx, of a world that was rich and connected but also fragile. A reminder that even the mightiest civilizations are vulnerable to the tides of history.